Now that your husband is gone, maybe it's time you accept that this house isn't really yours anymore," my daughter-in-law said, as calmly as if she were suggesting I switch brands of coffee, and I remember thinking how strange it was that something so small, so casually spoken, could make an entire life feel like it had just slipped out from under me, because just a week earlier I had been standing beside my husband's grave, the late autumn wind cutting through my coat, telling myself that no matter how empty the world felt, at least I still had a home to return to, a place where every floorboard carried the echo of our 38 years together. But that night, sitting at the same dining table where I had served Sunday dinners for decades, I realized I had been wrong. The house felt different, not just because he was gone, but because the people sitting across from me no longer looked at me the same way. Daniel didn't meet my eyes. He kept adjusting his napkin, folding and unfolding it like he was trying to avoid something, and Ashley, with her perfectly composed posture and that faint, practiced smile, watched me the way you might watch a problem you've already decided how to solve. I didn't respond right away. I reached for my glass of water, noticed my hand trembling just slightly, and set it back down without taking a sip, because I understood something in that moment, something cold and quiet. This wasn't grief talking, this wasn't awkwardness after a funeral, this was something else entirely, something that had been building long before I ever noticed it, the kind of shift that doesn't happen overnight but reveals itself all at once, like a crack in a window you suddenly realize has been there for weeks. "I've managed this house just fine," I said finally, keeping my voice steady, almost gentle, because I had spent a lifetime choosing peace over conflict, smoothing over tensions, making sure everyone felt comfortable even when I didn't. Ashley tilted her head slightly, as if considering my words, then gave a soft, dismissive shrug. "That was when Richard was here," she replied, using my husband's name in a way that felt oddly deliberate. "Things are different now." And there it was, the first clean break between what had been and what was coming. Daniel cleared his throat, still not looking at me. "Mom, we've been thinking," he said, and I noticed the word we, not I, not him, but we, as if whatever was about to be said had already been decided somewhere else, without me. "This house is a lot to handle, and it just makes sense to start making some changes." Changes, I repeated that word in my mind, turning it over like something unfamiliar. Changes didn't usually sound like ultimatums, but this one did. I glanced around the room, at the china cabinet I had polished every spring, at the curtains I had sewn myself, at the chair my husband used to sit in every evening with a cup of tea. Everything looked exactly the same, and yet none of it felt like it belonged to me anymore. And that was when I noticed something else, something small but impossible to ignore. The way Ashley's phone lit up on the table with a message preview that read, "Did she agree yet?" followed by a name I didn't recognize. I looked away before she could see that I had noticed, because suddenly, the conversation at the table felt less like a discussion and more like the final step in something that had already been set in motion, something I hadn't been meant to understand until it was too late, and for a moment, just a brief, quiet moment, I considered what it would look like to argue, to raise my voice, to demand explanations, but the feeling passed as quickly as it came, replaced by something steadier, something far more useful. I folded my napkin neatly and placed it beside my plate, just like I had done thousands of times before, and I smiled, not because I was amused, but because I had just realized something they hadn't. They thought they were taking something from me, something simple, something obvious, but they had no idea what actually belonged to me. And more importantly, what didn't belong to them at all. I did not sleep much that night, not because of what they had said, but because of how easily they had said it, as if I were no longer part of the equation, as if I had already been moved aside in their minds long before they ever spoke the words out loud, and the house, which had once been filled with the quiet comfort of routine, now felt unfamiliar in a way I could not explain, every sound sharper, every silence heavier. I woke before sunrise, the way I always had, out of habit more than necessity, and I walked into the kitchen, expecting to see the same soft morning light spilling across the countertops. But instead I noticed something small and precise. The coffee maker had been moved just a few inches to the left, not enough for anyone else to think twice about it, but enough for me to know that someone had been rearranging things, deciding what belonged where without asking me. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting lightly on the edge of the counter, remembering how Richard used to joke that I could tell if a single spoon had been moved out of place, and I realized then that this was not new, this quiet shifting. It had been happening for months, maybe longer. I had just chosen not to see it, or perhaps I had trusted that it meant nothing, that families adjusted, that people changed, and that love remained underneath it all. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the same way I always did, 2 sugars, a splash of cream, and I sat at the table where 3 chairs were still neatly pushed in and one remained slightly angled, the way Richard used to leave it when he stood up too quickly. I did not fix it. I left it exactly as it was, because some things still mattered, even if no one else seemed to notice anymore. I heard footsteps upstairs, followed by the soft murmur of voices, Daniel and Ashley, their words indistinct but their tone unmistakable, low, careful, the kind of conversation people have when they do not want to be overheard, and I found myself listening, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. Because suddenly I understood that whatever decisions were being made in this house were no longer including me. A door closed, footsteps crossed the hallway, and then silence again, the kind that lingers just a little too long. I took a sip of my coffee, now lukewarm, and stared out the window at the backyard Richard had spent years tending, the grass still neatly trimmed, the garden beds prepared for winter, everything in its place, everything maintained as if he might walk back outside at any moment and continue where he left off, and yet inside, everything was shifting in ways I could no longer ignore. Later that morning, I walked past the hallway closet and noticed the door slightly open. Inside, a few of my coats were missing, not gone entirely. Just fewer than I remembered, enough to make me pause, enough to make me count, and then count again. I closed the door slowly, my fingers brushing against the wood, smooth and familiar, and I felt something settle inside me, not panic, not anger, but clarity, the kind that comes when pieces begin to fall into place, when small details start forming a pattern that can no longer be dismissed as coincidence. I moved through the house quietly, not wanting to interrupt whatever illusion they believed they were maintaining. And when I passed the living room, I noticed a folder on the coffee table, partially tucked beneath a magazine. I would not have looked twice at it before, but now I did. I stepped closer, just enough to read the heading printed across the top, Real Estate Listing Agreement. The words were crisp, official, undeniable. I did not pick it up, I did not need to. I already understood, this was never about helping me, never about concern for my well-being. It was about control, about ownership, about deciding my place without my consent. I turned away from the table and walked back toward the kitchen, my steps steady, measured, because there was no longer any reason to rush. They believed they were ahead, that everything was already decided, but they had overlooked something important. Something they had never taken the time to learn about me. I had spent my entire life watching, listening, understanding the spaces between what people said and what they meant, and now, for the first time, I was going to use that understanding not to keep the peace, but to protect what was mine. By the afternoon, the house had settled into a kind of quiet that no longer felt peaceful. It felt staged, as if every room was waiting for something to happen, or perhaps waiting for me to leave. I moved slowly through the hallway, not because I was tired, but because I was paying attention now, to everything, to the way Ashley's shoes were placed neatly by the door as if she had always lived here, to the way Daniel's jacket hung on the coat rack where Richard used to hang his, as if he had stepped into a role he did not fully understand. And as I passed the living room again, I noticed the folder was no longer on the table. It had been moved, hidden, or perhaps taken upstairs, and that told me more than anything written inside it ever could. It meant they knew it should not be seen. It meant there were conversations happening that were not meant for me. I paused at the bottom of the staircase when I heard my name, not spoken loudly, but clearly enough that I could not pretend I had imagined it. "She will not question it," Ashley said, her voice calm, certain, the kind of certainty that only comes from believing you have already won. Daniel responded, quieter, hesitant. "I do not know, she has been acting different." There was a brief silence, followed by a soft exhale. "She is grieving, Daniel. People in her position do not fight, they accept what is easier." Easier, I repeated that word in my mind, and I realized then how they saw me, not as a person with history, with resilience, but as someone who would choose comfort over truth, someone who would step aside because it was simpler than standing firm. I did not move, I did not make a sound, I let the silence return, and then I walked into the kitchen as if I had heard nothing at all. I opened the refrigerator, took out a container I had prepared the day before, and set it on the counter, my movements steady, deliberate, because the moment I reacted would be the moment I lost control of the situation, and control, I understood now, was the only thing that mattered. A few minutes later, Ashley entered the room, her expression composed, her tone light. "You are up early," she said, as if the morning had not already revealed more than she intended. I nodded slightly. "I always am," I replied, and for a moment, we stood there in a silence that felt almost polite, but beneath it, something sharper, something unspoken. She glanced toward the hallway, then back at me. "Daniel and I were thinking we could start organizing some things this week, make it easier for you." There it was again, the word easier, offered like a kindness, shaped like a solution. I placed the container back into the refrigerator and closed the door gently. "That sounds thoughtful," I said, and I watched the flicker of surprise cross her face, brief but unmistakable. She had expected resistance, or confusion, not agreement, not calm. "I want this to be simple for everyone," I continued, and this time, her smile returned, more confident now, as if she had just confirmed something she had believed all along. "Exactly," she said. "That is all we want." I nodded once, slowly, and turned away, because I did not need to see anything more. I already knew what they thought this was, a transition, a rearrangement, a quiet handover of something they believed had already become theirs. But as I walked back down the hallway, I let my hand brush lightly against the wall, feeling the familiar texture beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in something they could not see, something they had never taken the time to understand. This house was not just walls and furniture, it was decisions, signatures, conversations that had taken place long before Ashley ever stepped through the front door. Long before Daniel had decided to look away instead of stand beside me. And for the first time since that dinner, I allowed myself to acknowledge what had been forming beneath the surface, not fear, not doubt, but something far more precise. They believed I would step aside, that I would make this easy, and perhaps I would, but not in the way they expected, because while they were planning how to take control, I was beginning to understand exactly how much control I had never actually lost that afternoon. I found myself standing in the doorway of our bedroom, the one Richard and I had shared for nearly 4 decades, and for a moment I did not step inside. I simply stood there, taking in the quiet, the stillness that had settled into the room in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if time itself had paused out of respect for everything that had once filled that space. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand, folded neatly beside the book he had been halfway through, a small detail that should have been comforting, but now felt like a reminder that everything important in my life had been left unfinished. I walked in slowly, my hand brushing against the edge of the dresser, and I caught my reflection in the mirror, silver hair pulled back, posture straight, expression calm, and I realized that I did not look like someone who had lost control of her life. I looked like someone who had simply not yet decided what to do next. I opened the top drawer and found the letters Richard had kept, documents, notes, small pieces of a life built carefully over time, and as I sifted through them, I remembered conversations we had shared late at night, quiet discussions about the future, about security, about making sure that no matter what happened, I would be protected. He had always been precise, always thinking ahead, always considering details that others might overlook, and at the time, I had trusted him completely without needing to understand every decision. But now, standing there with those papers in my hands, I began to see the shape of something more intentional, something that had been put in place long before any of this began. I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping slightly beneath me, and I let the memories come. Not as something to hold on to, but as something to learn from. I remembered the way he had insisted on handling certain paperwork himself, the way he would say, "It is better this way," without offering much explanation, and I had accepted it, because that was how we had always worked. He handled what needed to be handled, and I trusted that he was doing it with care, with purpose, with me in mind. And now, as I looked down at the folder in my lap, I understood that he had not just been thinking about our life together, he had been thinking about what would happen after, about what might change, about who might step forward and who might step back, and more importantly, about who might try to take what did not belong to them. I closed the drawer gently and stood up, holding on to that realization like something solid, something real, because it was the first thing that had made sense since the night at the dinner table. Downstairs, I could hear the faint sound of movement, Ashley's voice, light and controlled, Daniel responding in short, uncertain tones, and I realized how different it all sounded now, not just their words, but the space between them, the careful timing, the quiet assumptions. I walked back toward the door and paused, my hand resting on the frame, and I allowed myself one final look at the room, not with sadness, but with clarity, because this was no longer just a place filled with memories, it was a place filled with answers, answers they did not know existed, answers they had not thought to look for, and as I stepped back into the hallway, I felt something shift inside me, something steady and certain. They believed they understood the situation, they believed they had already mapped out the outcome, but they had built their confidence on incomplete information, on assumptions, on the belief that I would not question, would not look deeper, would not act, and that belief, I realized, was going to be their first mistake, because while they were preparing to take something from me, I was beginning to understand exactly what had been left in my hands, and how little of it they had any claim to at all. The next morning arrived with the same quiet rhythm, but this time I did not move through it out of habit, I moved through it with intention, every step measured, every glance deliberate. I made my coffee the same way, set the cup in the same spot, and sat at the table as if nothing had changed, because to them, nothing had. They still believed I was following the script they had written for me, grieving, confused, slowly stepping aside, and I allowed that belief to remain untouched. Ashley came into the kitchen not long after, her expression composed, her movements efficient. She reached for a glass, filled it with water, and leaned lightly against the counter, watching me in that subtle way she had perfected, not openly, but enough to measure my reaction. "Daniel spoke to a realtor yesterday," she said casually, as if mentioning the weather. "Just to explore options." I nodded once, taking a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch just enough to make her continue. "Nothing is final, of course, we just thought it would be good to be prepared." Prepared, I thought, another careful word, one that sounded responsible, even considerate, but underneath it carried something far more calculated. I set my cup down gently and looked at her, not with confrontation, but with calm acknowledgement. "That makes sense," I said, and this time the surprise on her face was harder to hide. She had expected hesitation, perhaps even resistance, but not agreement, not ease. "I want things to be simple for everyone," I added, repeating her language, returning it to her in a way that made it clear I understood exactly what was being said. She straightened slightly, her confidence settling back into place. "Exactly," she replied. "We all just want what is best." I gave a small nod, and for a moment, the conversation ended there. But the air between us had shifted, not in a way she could identify, but enough that I could feel it, because I was no longer reacting, I was observing, and that changed everything. Later that afternoon, I stepped out onto the back porch, the air cool, the sky overcast, the kind of day that made everything feel still. And I looked out at the yard Richard had cared for so meticulously, the lines of the garden bed still clean, the edges trimmed with precision, and I remembered the afternoon he had stood exactly where I was standing, holding a folder in his hands, explaining something about ownership, about documentation, about making sure everything was structured properly. I had not paid close attention at the time, not because I did not care, but because I trusted him, and now that memory returned with a clarity that felt almost deliberate, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. I went back inside and walked straight to the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one we rarely used, opened the drawer, and found the set of keys he had always kept there, neatly arranged, untouched. I took them out slowly, feeling their weight in my hand, and for the first time, I allowed myself to follow through on the thought that had been forming since the night at the table. I moved down the hallway, past the kitchen where I could hear Ashley on the phone speaking in that same controlled tone, past the staircase where I had first heard my name spoken in quiet certainty, and into the study, the room that had always been his. The one space in the house that had remained unchanged. I closed the door behind me softly and stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle. Then I crossed to the cabinet against the far wall, the one he had always kept locked, the one I had never had a reason to open, until now. I selected the key carefully, turned it in the lock, and opened the door. Inside, everything was exactly as he had left it, folders arranged with precision, labels clear and deliberate, and as I reached for the first file, I felt something steady settle into place within me, not anger, not fear, but certainty, because whatever they believed they were taking from me, whatever plans they had made in quiet conversations and hidden documents, they had overlooked the one thing that mattered most. They had assumed I would never look for the truth, and in that assumption, they had already lost more than they realized the moment I opened the first file. I understood why Richard had always been so particular about keeping this room locked. Every document inside was arranged with a precision that reflected not just organization, but intention. I sat down at his desk, the leather chair creaking softly beneath me, and began to read slowly, carefully, not rushing through a single page, because I knew that whatever answers I was looking for would not be found in a glance. They would be found in the details, in the wording, in the things most people would overlook. The first folder contained property records, not just for this house, but for several assets I had never been fully aware of, each one documented clearly, each one structured in a way that made ownership unmistakable. My name appeared again and again, not beside his, but instead of it, and I paused, letting that settle in, because it was not what I had expected, not what they had expected either. I turned to the next document, a legal addendum attached to his will, written with careful language, precise and firm, outlining conditions that had been put in place to protect those assets, conditions that could not be bypassed, not by assumption, not by convenience, not even by family. I read it twice. Then a third time, not because I did not understand it, but because I wanted to be certain, absolutely certain, that what I was seeing was real, and with each reading, the picture became clearer. This house was not something that could be reassigned simply because someone believed it should be. It was not something that could be taken through quiet decisions made over dinner conversations. It was secured, protected in ways that required more than confidence and planning to undo. I leaned back slightly, the paper still in my hands, and let out a slow breath, not of relief, but of recognition. Richard had seen something, perhaps not this exact situation, but something close enough that he had prepared for it. He had anticipated a moment when I might need more than trust, more than hope. He had left me something far more valuable, clarity. I placed the document back into the folder and closed it gently, my movements steady, controlled. Because now I understood the full weight of what they had overlooked. Upstairs, I could hear faint movement again. Footsteps crossing the hallway, a door opening and closing, their routine continuing as if everything was unfolding exactly as planned, and in a way, it was, just not in the direction they believed. I stood up from the desk and walked back to the cabinet, placing the folder exactly where I had found it, aligning it with the others so that nothing appeared disturbed, because this was not the moment to reveal anything. This was the moment to observe, to allow them to continue, to give them the space to move forward with their assumptions. I turned the key, closed the cabinet, and slipped it back into my pocket, a small, simple action, but one that carried a quiet finality. As I stepped out of the study, I paused in the hallway, listening for a moment, not to hear their words, but to feel the rhythm of the house, the way it moved, the way it breathed, because I was no longer reacting to it, I was reading it, understanding it, and for the first time since that night, I felt something settle into place with complete certainty. They believed I was being guided toward an outcome, that I was slowly accepting a transition they had already decided upon, but what they did not realize was that the outcome had already been written, long before they ever started planning, and the only question left now was how long I would allow them to continue before I chose to turn the page that evening. I joined them at the dinner table again, not because I felt obligated, but because I understood that this was where they felt most confident, where their plans unfolded in quiet certainty, where they believed they controlled the narrative. And I wanted to see how far they were willing to go. The table was set neatly. Ashley had prepared everything with care, as if maintaining the appearance of normalcy was part of the strategy. Daniel sat across from me, his posture slightly tense, his eyes occasionally lifting before quickly looking away, and I noticed how often he deferred to her, not just in words, but in timing, in silence, in the way he waited for her to lead the conversation. "I spoke with the realtor again today," Ashley began, her tone calm, almost pleasant. "He thinks the house could be listed within the next 2 weeks if we move quickly." I nodded slowly, cutting a small piece of food on my plate, not because I was hungry, but because the rhythm of normal behavior was important. "That sounds efficient," I replied, and I could feel Daniel shift slightly, as if my response had unsettled him. Ashley continued, encouraged by the lack of resistance. "There are also some senior communities nearby, very comfortable, very well maintained. I think you would like them." She spoke the words smoothly, carefully choosing each one, wrapping the decision in language that sounded thoughtful, supportive, as if she were offering me something rather than taking something away. I placed my fork down gently and looked at her, not with challenge, but with quiet interest. "You have done a lot of research," I said, and for a brief moment she smiled, a small acknowledgement of her own effort. "I just want what is best for everyone," she replied, and there it was again, that phrase, repeated like a foundation they believed could not be questioned. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting a small pause settle over the table, long enough to make them both aware of it, but not long enough to feel confrontational. "Then we should make sure everything is handled properly," I said, my voice even, measured, and I watched the way their expressions shifted, subtle, but unmistakable. Daniel looked up this time, his brow tightening slightly. "What do you mean?" he asked, and I held his gaze just long enough before answering. "I mean that important decisions should always involve the right people, the right documentation, the right process." I picked up my glass and took a slow sip. Letting the words settle without explanation, Ashley's posture straightened, her smile tightening just slightly at the edges. "Of course," she said, though her tone had changed, just enough to reveal that something no longer felt entirely certain to her. "That is exactly what we are doing." I nodded once, as if satisfied, and returned to my plate, allowing the conversation to drift into quieter territory. But I could feel it now, the shift beneath the surface, small, but growing, because they had expected passivity, acceptance, a quiet transition, and instead they had encountered something else, something they had not prepared for, awareness, not loud, not aggressive, but present, steady, and impossible to ignore. After dinner, I cleared my plate as I always had, rinsed it, set it in the rack, each movement deliberate, each action reinforcing the image they still believed in. And as I turned off the kitchen light and walked toward the hallway, I heard Ashley's voice again, softer. This time, more controlled. "She knows something," she said, and Daniel's response came quickly, uncertain. "No, she would have said something." There was a pause, a tension that lingered in the air, and I continued walking without slowing down, because they were both right in different ways. I did know something, and I had not said anything, not yet, because this was no longer about reacting to what they were doing. This was about choosing the moment when everything they believed would finally be placed in front of them, clearly, unmistakably, and when that moment came, it would not be raised voices or confrontation that changed everything. It would be something far quieter, far more precise. Something they could not argue with, could not dismiss, could not undo. The next morning felt quieter than the ones before, not because the house had changed, but because something had settled beneath the surface. Something neither Daniel nor Ashley could quite name. I moved through the kitchen with the same steady rhythm, pouring coffee, setting the cup down, glancing briefly out the window as if the world outside still held the same shape it always had. But I could feel their attention now. Subtle, cautious, the way people watch something they no longer fully understand. Daniel entered first, his steps slower than usual, his eyes lingering on me just a moment longer before he looked away. And Ashley followed shortly after, her expression composed but her movements more deliberate, as if she were measuring each action against a new uncertainty. "We scheduled a meeting," she said, breaking the silence with a tone that tried to remain light but carried a trace of urgency beneath it. "With the realtor and someone who can help with the paperwork, just to make everything official." I nodded once, taking a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle before I responded. "That sounds appropriate," I said, and the simplicity of my answer seemed to catch them off guard again, because it did not match the resistance they had been preparing for. Daniel shifted slightly, his voice lower when he spoke. "It is just to make things easier moving forward," he added, repeating the same reasoning that had been used before, and I gave a small, almost thoughtful nod. "Then we should make sure everything is clear," I replied, setting my cup down with quiet precision, and for the first time. Neither of them responded immediately. The silence that followed was different, not empty, but filled with something unspoken, something that had begun to take shape between us. Later that afternoon, I sat alone in the study again, the door closed, the same folder open in front of me. But this time I was not searching for answers, I was confirming them, reading through each line with calm certainty. Tracing the structure of what had already been secured, the language precise, the conditions firm, and I found myself pausing on a particular section, one that outlined not just ownership, but authority, the kind that did not rely on assumption or agreement, but on documentation that could not be reinterpreted. I closed the folder gently, resting my hand on top of it for a moment, and allowed the weight of that understanding to settle fully, because this was no longer about what they believed. It was about what could be proven, and proof did not require raised voices or arguments, it simply required the right moment. When I stepped back into the hallway, I could hear them again, their voices lower now, more cautious. "The sooner we finalize everything, the better," Ashley was saying, and Daniel responded with a quiet hesitation. "I just do not want this to become complicated." Complicated, I thought, another word chosen carefully, another attempt to shape the situation into something manageable, predictable. I continued walking, my steps even, my presence unannounced. Because I did not need to interrupt them, not yet. The meeting they had arranged would come soon enough, and when it did, everything they believed would be placed in front of them in a way that could not be adjusted or explained away. That evening, the house felt different again, but not in the way it had before. This time, the shift was not something they were controlling, it was something they were beginning to sense. Even if they could not fully understand it, Ashley moved through the kitchen with a sharper focus, Daniel remained quieter, more observant, and I continued as I always had, calm, measured, allowing the rhythm of the house to remain intact, because disruption was not necessary, not when the truth itself would be enough. As I turned off the lights and walked down the hallway, I paused briefly, my hand resting against the wall, feeling the familiar steadiness beneath my fingertips, and for the first time since all of this began, I allowed a single thought to settle clearly in my mind. They were no longer leading this situation, they were simply moving within it, unaware that the outcome had already been decided. And when the moment came, it would not be a confrontation that changed everything, it would be something far simpler, far quieter. The undeniable weight of what had always been mine the morning of the meeting arrived without ceremony, no raised voices, no tension that could be easily named, just a quiet sense of movement beneath everything, like the house itself understood that something was about to shift. I dressed the same way I always did, simple, composed, nothing that would draw attention. Because attention was not what I needed, clarity was. Daniel stood near the front door, checking his watch more often than necessary, while Ashley adjusted the sleeve of her jacket with precise, controlled movements, and when we stepped outside, the air was cool, steady, the kind that sharpens your thoughts rather than distracts them. The office was smaller than I expected, neutral, professional, the kind of place where decisions are made without emotion. The realtor greeted us first, polite, efficient, followed by a man Ashley introduced as someone who would handle the details, and I noticed the way she spoke with quiet confidence, as if she had already rehearsed this moment. We sat at a rectangular table, papers neatly arranged, pens aligned, everything prepared for a process they believed was already understood. "We have outlined the next steps," Ashley began, her voice smooth, controlled. "So that we can move forward quickly and make this transition as easy as possible." There it was again, that word, easy, repeated so often it had almost lost its meaning. The man beside her opened a folder and began explaining timelines, signatures, procedures, each word layered in professionalism, each sentence building toward a conclusion they believed was inevitable. I listened without interruption, my hands resting calmly on the table, my posture steady, because this was not the moment to speak, this was the moment to let them complete their version of the story. Daniel nodded occasionally, his agreement quiet but present, and Ashley watched me carefully, waiting for hesitation, for confusion, for any sign that I did not understand what was happening. But I gave her none. When the explanation ended, the man slid a set of documents toward me. "If everything looks good, we can begin here," he said, his tone neutral, practiced. I glanced down at the papers, the same structured language, the same assumptions written into every line, and I allowed a brief pause to settle over the table, not long enough to create discomfort, just long enough to shift the rhythm. Then I reached into my bag and placed a single folder on the table, the same one I had reviewed the night before, the same one they had never considered might exist. "Before we proceed," I said, my voice even, measured, "there are a few documents that should be reviewed." I opened the folder slowly, turning it so that it faced them, and for the first time, the certainty in the room changed, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough, the kind of shift that happens when something expected is replaced by something undeniable. The man reached forward first, scanning the pages, his expression tightening slightly as he read, then Daniel leaned in, his brow furrowing, and Ashley, who had remained composed until that moment, grew very still, her eyes moving across the document with increasing focus. I did not need to explain anything, the language spoke for itself, ownership clearly defined, authority explicitly stated, conditions outlined with a precision that left no room for interpretation. The silence that followed was different from any we had shared before. It was not polite, not controlled, it was the kind of silence that comes when something cannot be adjusted to fit expectation. Daniel looked at me then, truly looked at me for the first time since this had begun, and there was something in his expression I had not seen in a long time, not just surprise, but understanding. Ashley sat back slightly, her posture no longer as certain, her carefully constructed confidence beginning to unravel in the absence of control. I closed the folder gently, my hands steady, my expression unchanged, and I met their gaze without urgency, without anger, just clarity. "I believe this makes everything clear," I said, and I let the words rest there, without emphasis, without explanation, because they did not need either. The outcome had already been decided long before any of us sat down at that table, and as I stood, gathering my things with quiet precision, I allowed myself one final thought, not spoken aloud, not shared, but understood completely. They had not just misjudged the situation, they had misjudged me, and that was something far more difficult to recover from than any document they had failed to read.